35,000 feet over the Bering Sea. The radio crackles. Northwest 85 confirms an emergency. A giant Boeing 747 is in serious trouble. This is no ordinary flight. This is a red emergency. Everyone is bracing for the worst. The crew is battling a near out-of-control bird, while the 386 passengers in the back can only entrust their fate to those in the cockpit. That afternoon, after dinner, the cabin is quiet. The flight has passed over Alaska, nearly halfway from Detroit to Narita, Japan. Captain John Hansen, a veteran pilot and Boeing 747 instructor, is preparing to hand over the flight deck. On the 13.5-hour flight, two crews take turns flying to avoid fatigue. Everything was going as they had on hundreds of other flights, until it happened. Without warning, the giant plane rolled 35-40 degrees to the left. A sudden, violent roll, as if someone had thrown the entire cabin into a tornado. The autopilot cut out. Captain Gu and his co-pilot rushed to regain control. The engines were still running, but the plane was not listening. It took them only a few seconds to figure out the culprit, the rudder system. The lower rudder was stuck 17 degrees to the left. On a 747, the upper and lower rudders should be synchronized, but now they were not. This was the nightmare that had claimed American Airlines Flight 587 in New York just a year earlier. They knew the consequences of losing control completely. Gu braced himself to keep the plane flying straight, using all his skills to compensate, while the co-pilot flipped through the emergency handbook for a solution. The instructions read, "Do not release hydraulic pressure." And that was it. Not a single line of communication about how to get 386 lives out of the window. In the bleak, desolate skies above the Bering Sea, the crew knew that if there was ever a moment to fly perfectly, it was now. In the vast expanse of the ocean, there was no control tower close enough to hear their distress calls. Northwest 85 was in a radio dead zone, a place where the world seemed cut off. The pilots tried to contact anyone nearby and eventually picked up Northwest 19, another flight flying closer to Alaska. "Northwest 19, this is Northwest 85. We have an emergency. Please relay to Anchorage." There was a tense silence, then a reply. "Roger, wait. Okay, I'll report back." And at that moment, the giant 747 began a wide right turn, nose first toward Anchorage. But there was one fatal problem: rudder. Without rudder, a simple turn became a nightmare. Captain Frank Gu knew that one wrong move could send the plane into an inescapable spin. He had to use all his flaps and ailerons to control it. But the plane still slid sideways like a car going out of control on a curve. The lower rudder was stuck at 17 degrees to the left. It was unresponsive. They didn't know if it was about to break off. There was no training, no rescue instructions. Just experience, composure, and survival instincts. 35,000 feet in the air, more than an hour and 40 minutes from the nearest airport, 386 lives were in the hands of two men battling a 400-ton metal bird. Captain John Hansen, a Boeing 747 instructor, stepped into the cockpit. Seeing Frank Gu struggling, he knew he had to take over. "Frank, you've done a great job, but now let me fly. If anyone messes this up, let me." The handover was silent. Officer Fagan held the controls as Hansen took control. The cockpit held its breath. One wrong jolt, and it would all be over. Outside, the plane was still headed toward Anchorage. Inside the cabin, a false calm reigned. No one knew the rudder could be torn off at any moment. Finally, they decided they had to tell everyone. Captain Gu and Hansen agreed honesty was the only way. Frank Gu stood up and walked into the passenger compartment, his eyes calm but stormy. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Frank. We are having trouble and will be returning to Anchorage for an emergency landing. Our crew is doing everything they can to ensure your safety. Please remain calm and listen to the flight attendants. Your cooperation is extremely important." No one shouted. No one panicked. Just tense looks, mixed with fragile trust in the people in the cockpit. The crew called this a red emergency, a situation where everyone had to prepare for the worst. The plane could land safely, or it could fall apart as soon as it hit the ground. But there was no turning back. Inside the cabin, the initial silence began to crack. Occasionally, a choked sob could be heard. A few passengers looked around, their eyes meeting, sharing the same fear. The crew knew they needed more help from the ground, and the name S came to mind. To communicate, they had to use the HF radio system. The signal was weak, intermittent, and distorted like the can phone game they played as kids. Two Campbell's soup cans connected by a string, except now, above them, the North Pacific. On the other end of the line, in Minnesota, Northwest's operations center began to vibrate. The urgent message asked for John Dye, a leading Boeing 747-400 expert and Captain Hansen's longtime friend. That night, John was at home, enjoying his favorite movie, when his pager rang. He knew right away something big was happening. In the cockpit, Hansen had no idea that help was on the way. He only knew that with each passing second, it was becoming harder to keep the giant metal bird balanced at 35,000 feet. The controls were shaking. The whole plane was shaking like a beast, straining to endure. He made the decision to descend to a lower altitude where the thicker air could provide more lift. But this was no ordinary maneuver. With a plane so badly damaged, every touch of the controls could be the last. "Okay, slowly, very, very carefully," Hansen said, his eyes never leaving the controls. The pilots were using each finger, each turn, so delicate, as if they were controlling a crystal egg hanging on the edge of a cliff. No one was sure what lay ahead. The tail might have cracked, the rudder might have been hanging loose, or there might have been a catastrophic hydraulic failure. 28,000 feet. They landed safely. No more erratic oscillations. No more deadly jolts. Just a sigh of relief and a tense silence as everyone knew the real test was still ahead. I told myself I could manage, but the effort it took to control the crippled 747 was draining. Captain Hansen could feel the strain on every muscle. His legs were starting to cramp, cold sweat beaded on his forehead. Just keeping the plane on track was like wrestling a giant beast. "My legs are starting to cramp. I can only hold this for 10 minutes, he said, his voice strained. Mike nodded, ready to take over. The changeover had to be smooth, because one wrong move could send the plane careening off course. Hansen tightened his shoulders and back, locked his legs, and released the controls so Mike could take over. Outside, it was still dark. Inside, the countdown clock was more than an hour away from anchorage. Inside the cabin, the flight attendants began the red emergency procedure. Every locker and service counter was locked. Crew luggage was stowed away. Everyone worked without a word, but everyone knew the meaning of the silence. I remember passing a family of 3. They asked me, "Are you scared?" For a moment, I considered lying. Then I looked them straight in the eye and said, "Yes, I am, but we have the best pilots on this flight." Finally, the connection to John D. was successful. His voice came through the distorted radio waves. "It's John. I've been briefed. I understand you're having a control problem." Hansen quickly replied, "Yes, the IC is indicating a jammed lower rudder." John was silent for a second, then spoke slowly. "You're facing an extremely rare situation. We've never trained for this. We've never seen it in action. And now we're going to have to figure it out in the air." John took a deep breath, as if he were picturing their entire cockpit in his mind. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low. "You can't rely on the rudder. All turns must be made by ailerons and engine power. No jerks, no sudden changes, or the tail will be under too much pressure." Hansen and Mike looked at each other. They knew what or else meant total loss of control. Out there was an icy sea, no light, and the distance to anchorage was still a long cut on the map. John continued, "When you descend, remember, keep a steady speed. Don't let the plane slide sideways. Think of it as leading an elephant on thin ice. Gently, steadily, patiently." In the cabin, the flight attendants made their final announcements to the passengers, their voices shaking but clear. The sound of seatbelts clicking everywhere. Some held hands tightly. Some closed their eyes in prayer. Some just stared out the windows where the black sky seemed to swallow the plane. Hansen tried to lose a little more altitude, and the plane shook violently in protest. The cockpit held its breath. Mike held the controls, Hansen adjusted the power, and miraculously, the 747 stabilized. They exchanged a brief nod, not joy, just a glimmer of hope. "You're doing well," John's voice boomed. "Keep it up. We'll get this bird back to land." The night wind from Cook Inlet blew against the nose of the plane, making it vibrate as if to remind them that this was no ordinary landing. On the Anchorage air traffic control radar screen, the bright dot labeled Northwest 85 was slowly approaching, but for those on board, the minutes felt like a lifetime. Hansen gripped the controls, cold sweat rolling down his temples. Mike had his hands on the controls, feeling the tiny vibrations of the massive metal. In their ears, John's voice was still deep and decisive. "Don't let the speed drop too fast. Remember to increase 20 knots on approach. When we reach the runway, I'll take the rudder and brake. You hold the yoke. We only have one chance." Outside, the Alaskan mountains loomed under the moonlight. The white snow glistening as if watching, waiting to see if this iron bird could pass the final test. Inside the cabin, the flight attendants made a final check. Seatbelts were locked, luggage was stowed, their eyes met briefly but contained 1,000 unspoken words. Some passengers closed their eyes in prayer. Others clasped the hands of their loved ones as if they were afraid that if they let go, they would be lost forever. Northwest 85, runway 6 right, stand by. Emergency equipment on standby. The controller's voice was steady, but no one on board could mistake this for a safe situation. They knew that one small mistake could send the 747 flying into 1,000 pieces. Hansen looked at Mike, then down at the controls, taking a deep breath. He knew that this was the moment when his entire career, his experience, and the lives of the nearly 400 people on board depended on his every move. The flaps were up, the landing gear was down. The plane was like a giant, wounded beast trying to land on a narrow strip of land between the ice and the rocks. Mike whispered, "Ready?" Hansen just nodded. The left engine roared as it increased power. The right engine slowed to maintain balance. The plane tilted slightly, then slowly straightened. Each second seemed to drag on forever. At 300 meters, the entire plane's frame shook violently. On the ground, a long line of fire trucks and ambulances waited, their red lights flashing like a marker marking the end of a life-or-death journey. In the cockpit, no one said another word. There was only the sound of wind whistling through the wings, the roar of the engines, and the pounding of hearts. Hansen brought the plane onto the runway. Everything became strangely silent, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for the next moment. And then, the landing gear hit the ground. A strong jolt threw everything forward. The sound of steel and concrete grinding against each other echoed throughout the cabin. Ike held the yoke. Hansen hit the brakes. The rudder protested violently but still endured. The 747 roared, shook violently, and then slowly slowed down. When the plane finally came to a stop, the cockpit was plunged into a moment of absolute silence before sighs, cries, and applause filled the cabin. They had survived. Do you want me to continue describing the emotions and scenes when everyone left the plane? Because if I did, the story would be much stronger. The air in the cockpit was as thick as compressed. In the final seconds before touching the runway in Anchorage, each heartbeat was like a countdown clock. First Officer Fagan tightened his grip on the control stick. Captain Hansen kept his eyes on the runway, his feet controlling the nose wheel on the badly damaged rudder system. They knew that with just one wrong turn, this 747 weighing more than 300 tons could slide off the runway like an out-of-control beast. "Bring to impact!" the call echoed in the passenger cabin. Hands gripped the handrails. A few whispered prayers rang out mixed with the thunderous roar of the engines. Outside, the lights of runway 6R stretched out like a road leading to fate. The landing gear touched the ground. A strong jolt ran through the body of the plane. Captain Hansen held the wheel. Fagan held the controls, coordinating every move as if this were a drill they had practiced all their lives. Except this time, there was no room for error. There was a long screech of friction, and then the plane stopped. "Good job, Mike. Good job, everyone." Hansen's voice was low but tinged with relief. A few soft sobs echoed in the cabin, but most of them still couldn't believe they had just escaped death. The flight attendants reassured the passengers, asking them to remain seated until the lights went out. Outside, the rescue team surrounded the plane. Step by step, people were evacuated. Just 2 hours earlier, at 35,000 feet in the freezing sky, 404 people had been on the brink of disaster. Now they were all safe on the ground. But the relief quickly gave way to the big question. What could have caused a modern Boeing 747-400 to lose control in the blink of an eye? Carolyn DeForge of the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, knew this was more than just a mechanical failure. It was a wake-up call for the entire airline industry. The investigation began as soon as the plane was towed to the engineering area. Engineers discovered a trail of hydraulic oil leaking from the tail of the plane. When they opened the panels, they were stunned. The end cap of the hydraulic control module, the part that connects the pilot's pedals to the rudder, had completely broken off, falling out of place. The piston inside had slipped beyond its design limit, causing the rudder to flip over and seize. The material used to make this part was Alloya aluminum alloy, a blend of copper, magnesium, and zinc, known for its strength and elasticity. In theory, it could withstand decades of flying without cracking. But before them was a part that had broken apart like a cheap toy. Metallurgist Sylvie Dion examined each crack through an electron microscope. The surface structure showed the phenomenon of metal fatigue, something that, according to calculations, would take 30,000 years of flying to occur. This was not only unusual but almost impossible. The problem now was not just finding the cause of the failure. Around the world, hundreds of other 747-400s still use this exact hydraulic module, carrying thousands of passengers every day. If it could happen to Northwest 85, who can say it won't happen again somewhere else? At a time when pilots don't have the time or the luck to get everyone safely back to land. Inside the NTSB investigation room, the air was thick with tension. Everyone knew that if a critical system like the power control module could fail prematurely, thousands of passengers around the world were sitting on an invisible time bomb. The scariest part was that it had completely fractured due to metal fatigue, but there was no obvious design or manufacturing defect. This made the investigation team start to suspect the nature of the material itself. They sent the entire assembly back to the manufacturer, ordering a series of intensive metallurgical tests. Under powerful microscopes, engineers peered at the alloy's crystal structure, the tiny grains that determine its strength, ductility, and resistance to crack propagation. If the grains were too small, the material would be brittle. If too large, it would be weak. Even one irregular shape could turn the entire system into a fatal weakness. Visual inspection was useless, so they turned to one of the most sophisticated methods available: fluorescence testing. Under ultraviolet light, any cracks or flaws would glow like tiny lightning bolts. But the results were disappointing. No abnormalities. There were no clues, no eureka moments. The team was going crazy. If it wasn't a material defect or a design flaw, then what could have destroyed the module? When all the theories ran out, a thought occurred. Maybe the history of the plane itself held the answer. When they dug through the records, they were shocked to realize that Northwest 85 was no ordinary 747-400. This was the first 747-400 delivered to Northwest, and the oldest of its kind in the world. Worse, before it became a commercial aircraft, it had been a Boeing test aircraft, undergoing a series of rigorous flights that exceeded standards. Over its lifetime, it had accumulated more than 55,000 flight hours and over 7,000 takeoffs and landings, significantly more than most 747s of its type. That opened a new line of inquiry. Could it be that the higher-than-designed loads caused the failure? Every time the system took off or landed, it was under tremendous stress, and short-haul operators, especially in Asia, were unwittingly pushing the module to its limits. The problem was that there was no way to directly inspect its internals without disassembling the entire thing, and grounding the fleet to do so was impossible. The NTSB eventually recommended that airlines inspect the power control module more frequently and more rigorously, on a recurring basis, as a preventative measure. But the root cause, the real reason Northwest 85's module had ruptured, remained a mystery. Then, 4 years later, the alarm bells rang again. An Air France 747-400 cargo plane suffered a rudder failure in mid-air, forcing an emergency landing in a scenario identical to Northwest 85. When the failed module was sent to the manufacturer in California, the engineer's reaction was almost appalling. "Oh my God, you wouldn't believe what just happened here," they said over the phone, their voices both excited and serious. If the module also showed signs of metal fatigue, it would be a step closer to solving the old mystery. But the results were surprising. This time, there was no metal fatigue. Instead, they discovered a manufacturing defect, a tiny crack hidden deep at the base of the thread, where the corner of the radius had been machined too sharply, creating a stress concentration. From there, the crack spread silently. This discovery perfectly explained the Air France incident, but it did nothing to solve the Northwest mystery. 2 incidents, same type of aircraft, same system, but completely different causes. And the scariest thing is, one of those 2 causes to this day is still lurking somewhere, waiting to happen again. Was it overloading? Or was it a form of failure that slowly built up over thousands of hours of flight? Or was it something the part had been exposed to in the environment? A pressure, a vibration, a shock that no one noticed, and then it quietly self-destructed from within. As investigators, it was frustrating and helpless to see a second time a part that was never designed to wear down nearly bring down a 747. One of those near tragedies remains unsolved, and they know that every day that passes without a new safety measure is another day that puts passengers' lives at risk. 4 years after the heart-stopping emergency landing in Anchorage, the 747's rudder remains a big question mark. And now the same part has failed on another flight. Next time it may not get a second chance. While the true cause of the Northwest 85 crash remains murky, the Air France findings have given investigators little reason to hesitate. They have recommended that special plugs be installed in the control module in case of a repeat failure. These plugs limit the angle of the rudder in both directions, ensuring that it never moves so far that it loses control. The FAA's directive made this solution mandatory. All 747-400s must be equipped with the new technology, eliminating the risk of an overshooting rudder. But amid the newfound confidence, a question quietly arises. Why didn't Flight 85 crash? The answer lies in a little-noticed detail: the 747's dual rudder design. Unlike most aircraft that have a single rudder, the 747 has 2 separate sections. If one actuator fails, the other retains some control. In this case, that unusual feature saved 404 lives. But technology alone isn't enough. The evidence is clear. In 1985, China Airlines Flight 006, with only one rudder, dropped nearly 30,000 feet before the pilot regained control. If Northwest 85's Captain Frank Gu hadn't reacted within the first few seconds, today's story might not have existed. His decision, cool, precise, unhesitating, kept the 747 under control long enough to find a way to land. But what really got it back to the ground was something else: the ability to work together as if the cockpit were a single organism. Frank gave the orders, Mike responded. Each task was clearly divided. The rudder, the thrust manager, the systems monitor, all fit together like gears in a perfectly lubricated machine. When the decision was made to prepare for impact, no one panicked. Everyone did exactly what they were trained to do, no more, no less. And when the 747's wheels touched the runway at 5 p.m., no one was hurt. Looking back, Frank says simply, "We knew we could trust each other." In a moment when the line between life and death was as thin as a thread, it was trust, communication, and coordination that became the invisible parachute that brought all 404 people safely back to the ground. The Alaskan sky that day seemed to swallow all sound, except for the wind whistling through the fuselage and the occasional metallic vibration. Beneath the massive silver skin of the 747, hundreds of hearts were still pounding, no one knowing for sure if they would ever touch the ground again. In the cockpit, no one spoke a word. Every short sentence, every nod, every touch of the control stick carried the weight of hundreds of lives. At that altitude, the slightest mistake could mean the end. Every parameter was constantly monitored: speed, altitude, wind direction, the response of every auxiliary system. The slightest vibration from the rudder would send all eyes flying to the dashboard. They knew the plane was in serious trouble, but it still had tens of minutes to fly to a safe runway. Frank recalled every accident he had studied. He knew that if he had been even a half-second late in his decision, they would be on the list. But today, he had an advantage that many other unfortunate pilots did not have. A team so in tune that they knew what each other was thinking without speaking. Mike kept the engine running, the co-pilot monitored the lift, and Frank focused on steering with the remaining rudder. They operated as a single brain. When Anchorage came into view, it was not the peaceful scene of a small coastal town, but the only lifeline in a dangerous ocean. The control tower had cleared the sky. All other planes were moving away. They knew Northwest 85 could not wait much longer. The moment the landing gear touched the runway, the whole body of the plane shook violently. But instead of flying off the runway like an out-of-control arrow, it slowed steadily, the roar of the engines fading away. When the plane came to a stop, there were several seconds of absolute silence. Then there were sighs, sobs, and even an explosion of applause. None of the 404 people on board that flight would ever forget this moment. To investigators, the story of Northwest 85 was more than just a mechanical failure. It was a living testament to the one thing that no blueprint, no software, no modern technology can replace: people. And it was the people, with their calm, their discipline, their superhuman coordination, who turned a certain tragedy into an aviation miracle. If you listen closely, somewhere on the Anchorage runway, the echoes of that moment still resonate. Not the sound of engines, but the synchronized heartbeats of men who had just defeated fate together. The NTSB conference room was packed. On the table were the disassembled control modules, each piece of metal carefully placed on a tray, glinting under the fluorescent lights. No one said much. Everyone was waiting for the aha moment, the one that would explain why a part designed to last the entire life of the plane had collapsed in midair. They tried everything: electron microscopes to see the microscopic metal particles, chemical analysis of each alloy layer, even reconstructions of the stresses the module had endured over decades of flight. Each time they thought they had found a clue, it disappeared like sand through their fingers. The Parker-Hannifin report was laid out on the table. Engineers leaned over the technical drawings, pointing to a tiny spot in the threaded part of the module's fuselage. A corner had been cut too sharply, a seemingly harmless detail that had become the starting point for a fatal crack. In the case of Air France, it was the cause. But for Northwest 85, it was a mystery that could not be filled. One investigator slammed his hand on the table, not in anger, but in frustration at the invisibility of the cause. "We can't wait until another 747 almost crashes to find out," he said. No one objected. The decision was made on the spot. The entire 747 to 400 fleet would be fitted with rudder limiters, mechanical stoppers that would prevent the rudder from going beyond safe limits. It was a stopgap measure, but it was the only thing standing between passengers and disaster. The FAA quickly made it mandatory. As he signed the final document, a young engineer whispered, "We still don't know why it failed." The words hung in the air, a reminder that no matter how advanced technology became, the skies still held secrets that humans had yet to touch. And somewhere among the 747-400s still flying, there may be a module waiting for the moment to reveal its weakness. But after Northwest 85, the aviation world will never be complacent again. The hearing room was ablaze with television cameras. In front of him were rows of NTSB commissioners. Behind them, rows of seats filled with journalists, passengers' families, and curious onlookers eager to hear the miraculous story of survival. Captain Frank sat upright, his uniform still as tight as that fateful day, but his eyes were deeper and heavier. Mike, the first officer, sat next to him, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles were white. When the microphone was turned on, the first sound was a deep breath. Frank began, his voice steady but taut as a string about to snap. "When the warning system went off, I knew right away that this was no ordinary malfunction. Hundreds of hours of training ran through my head, but not one of them taught me how to fly a 747 with the rudder stuck at that angle." Mike chimed in, his voice breaking. "You have to imagine, when the controls are off, everything in your body is fighting to keep flying. But stopping is not an option. We have to make do with what we have." He made a twisting motion with the steering wheel as if he were still in the cockpit, sweat beading on his temples. Frank continued, describing the moment of handover. "Every time we switched, we had only a few seconds to lock our feet, tense our shoulders, and transfer all our weight to the rudder pedals. It was like pulling a mooring line in a storm, just hoping it wouldn't snap." The room was silent. Even the seasoned investigators leaned forward slightly. Frank slowly admitted, "I was scared. And I think everyone should know that. But fear doesn't mean giving up. We turned fear into something that kept us sane." When he finished his testimony, Mike glanced at Frank and nodded slightly. They didn't need to say anything more, just that look was enough to let the audience know that, at an altitude of more than 10,000 meters that day, these two people put their lives on the line in exchange for 404 other lives. The Anchorage sky that afternoon was covered in thick gray clouds, the dim sunlight filtering through just enough to draw thin streaks of light on the icy runway. In the cockpit, the altimeter needle was dropping, each number changing a heart pounding in his ears. Frank gripped the controls, feeling the muscles from his shoulders down to his back tense as if they were being held between two blocks of steel. Mike kept his hands on the auxiliary control, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his movements in sync with Frank's like two dancers performing a once-in-a-lifetime routine. A half beat off would send the entire auditorium into a frenzy. The radio crackled. "Northwest 85, runway 7R is clear." Frank answered simply, "Roger," but his voice was hoarse. He glanced at Mike, not needing to say it aloud. This was a time to be wrong. The crosswinds grew stronger as they descended below 500 feet, the stuck rudder still trying to force the fuselage to one side. Both had to exert force to keep the nose from sliding past the center line. Each jolt was a reminder. If you missed by a split second, it would all be over. 100 feet. The rear cabin was so quiet you could hear the faint vibration of the seatbelts. 50 feet. Frank pushed the throttle to idle. Mike took a deep breath, his hands gripping the brakes as if readying for impact. 30 feet, 20, bang! The rear wheels hit the ground, the whole plane shook. An imperfect but safe landing. Cheers and cries erupted from the passenger compartment. Frank and Mike looked at each other, neither of them saying anything, just a tired smile. The smile of those who had just pulled 404 souls back from the brink. As the wheels came to a stop on the Anchorage runway, a wave of emotion swept through the cabin. There were sighs, applause, and sobs of those who had just escaped death. In the cockpit, Frank let go of the controls, a tingling sensation running down his arms and legs as if he had just gone through a century-long struggle. Mike turned to look out the window, his eyes red but strangely bright, the light of survival. When the plane door opened, the cold Alaskan wind rushed in, but no one felt cold. Passengers got off, many turned back to bow to thank the crew. A little girl hugged the flight attendant tightly, whispering, "Miss, I'm still scared, but I trust you." At that moment, everyone understood that in times of danger, trust and compliance with instructions are what hold people together. This event left a profound lesson that every airline passenger needs to remember. Air accidents often come unexpectedly and almost never give anyone a second chance. In urgent moments, the crew are not just servants. They are the only bridge between you and a chance of survival. Every word they say, every instruction they give, is built from thousands of hours of training and hard-won experience. Fastening your seatbelt while seated, even when the signal is off, is not a formality. It is an invisible shield that protects you from sudden turbulence. On that fateful flight, those who followed this rule avoided serious injury when the plane shook violently. Turning off your phone and electronic devices is not just a show or a dry rule. The electronic systems of an aircraft are extremely sensitive, and in an emergency, any interference, no matter how small, can hinder communication and control. Most importantly, never open a door, move luggage, or attempt to leave your seat without permission. In situations like Northwest 85, just one thoughtless action can cause chaos, waste time for the crew to respond, or even endanger everyone. The safe landing that day was not only due to the pilot's skill, not only to the design of the 747, but also to the absolute cooperation of the passengers. They listened, they followed, and thanks to that, everyone got off the plane on their own 2 feet. No one wants an accident, but when it happens, the only thing you can control is how you react. Remember, stay calm, listen, and trust the crew. Every safety regulation is not a nuisance, but the result of stories that you probably never want to experience. That day, 404 people returned home, and that lesson, compliance and trust, will fly forever, beyond every cloud, reminding that in the sky, sometimes it's the little things that decide the boundary between life and death. Thank you to all the viewers who have accompanied us throughout the journey of recreating Northwest Flight 85, a story of calm, skill, and the power of belief. Thank you for listening to every story, every tense moment, and experiencing with us the moment when the boundary between life and death is as fragile as a breath. We would like to thank all the pilots, flight attendants, engineers, air traffic controllers, the people who work tirelessly to make the sky safer every day. Thank you to the witnesses who opened up and shared their stories, so that the world knows that every safe flight is the result of thousands of perfectly coordinated links. And above all, thank you to the passengers who trusted, followed instructions, and remained calm even when their hearts were about to jump out of their chests. It was that cooperation that turned what seemed impossible into a miraculous landing. Hopefully, after watching this story, each of us will step onto the plane with a different perspective, more appreciative of seemingly small rules, more understanding of the work of those wearing the flight crew uniform, and remember that your safety always starts with you. See you again in the next stories, where we will continue to explore, learn, so that each flight is not just a journey, but also a testament to the strength of humans when facing challenges. Goodbye and see you in the sky.